I still remember the day his letter came, folded neat as a blade. It wasn't an invitation or a neighborly note. It was an increase, a demand, a reminder that in his eyes I was just another pocket to empty. My hands shook as I held it, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of years spent paying faithfully, believing loyalty meant something in this world. Tell me this, have you ever had someone treat your life's sweat and sacrifice like it was nothing more than a number on their ledger? I looked around my kitchen, at the bills stacked like bricks, at the wallpaper my wife once chose, faded but still clinging to the walls. The house wasn't just wood and nails, it was my last living testament. And yet, in one stroke of his pen, he tried to strip me of it. That was the moment something shifted in me. He thought he had the power, but I was about to show him otherwise. I didn't throw the letter away. No, I laid it flat on the kitchen table like evidence, the kind a jury would have to look at whether they wanted to or not. For hours I walked around it. I made coffee. I washed a dish that didn't need washing. But my eyes kept circling back to those numbers, bold and indifferent, as if they hadn't been typed for a person but for some faceless tenant. The house was quiet, too quiet. Silence can be heavier than sound, especially when you know what it's trying to tell you. My wife's voice used to fill these rooms. Even when she was angry, even when she scolded me for tracking mud in, the sound gave the walls meaning. Now it was just me and that letter, a pair of combatants staring each other down. What got me wasn't only the amount. It was the gall. The man knew I was steady. I'd paid my rent on time every month for decades. Rain or shine, sickness or health. That should have meant something. But to him, it was weakness. Reliability looked like a crack in the armor, a chance to squeeze. I sat in the chair by the window, the one with the dented armrest where my son used to teethe when he was little. I let the memories creep in. The kids running through the hall, slamming doors, tracking dirt. All of it had happened right here inside these same walls. This house wasn't perfect, but it was mine in every way that mattered, except on paper. That's when the first thought hit me, quiet but steady. Maybe he thought paper was the only thing that gave something value. Maybe he thought numbers were the only language a man like me could understand. So he was about to learn different. Still, I'll admit that night I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying what it would mean if I had to leave. Where would I go? A one-room place on the edge of town? Some dim apartment with thin walls where the neighbors argued through the night? That wasn't life, it was waiting for life to end. And I wasn't ready to sit quietly and wait. By morning, I had made up my mind. Not fully, not with all the details, but enough to know I wouldn't bow. My father used to say a man can bend without breaking, but once you bow, it's hard to straighten again. Those words rattled around in me as I poured my coffee and watched the street wake up outside. I remember thinking, funny thing about power, it only works if you accept the terms. He thought raising the rent meant I had two choices, pay or leave. But there was always a third choice, the kind that no one saw until it was staring them in the face. I called my daughter that afternoon. She lives 2 towns over, got her own troubles with bills and a boy who can't keep steady work. I didn't tell her the whole thing yet. I just asked about her week, asked about the weather. But she heard something in my voice. I could tell. She asked me if I was feeling all right. Elite. I told her I was fine. Sometimes the people closest to you can't carry your burden. You've got to carry it yourself until you know what you're doing with it. That evening, I took the long way home from the grocery store. Drove past the realtor's office. Lights still on even after hours. I slowed the car just enough to notice the signs in the window, bold letters declaring sold. For sale, under contract. They looked like little flags planted in the ground, claiming victory for whoever had the nerve to put them there first. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car longer than usual. The letter was still on the kitchen table waiting for me. But this time I wasn't circling it like prey. I was looking at it like a map. He thought he had me cornered, but I was already sketching out my way forward. And that's the thing about dignity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't throw dishes against the wall or curse the sky. It just sits quietly, waiting for you to notice it again. That night I noticed. I didn't tell anyone at first. The thought I had, that small seed of defiance, was too raw to expose. If I spoke it out loud too soon, someone might laugh, or worse, dismiss it. So I carried it inside me, letting it grow in silence. But silence doesn't last forever. It gets heavy, like a kettle left on the stove too long. And soon enough, someone close to you hears the whistle. 2 days later, the landlord came by. He didn't knock hard, just his usual half-tap like he owned the place already. When I opened the door, he gave me that smile people wear when they think they've already won. He didn't even bother with small talk. He just asked if I'd read his notice. I said yes. My voice was steady, though my stomach twisted. He nodded like it was a done deal, said he expected the new rent on the 1st. Not a question, not a discussion. Command. I didn't argue. I didn't show him what I was holding back. Instead, I told him I'd get back to him. He smirked, said something about how times are tough, and you'll understand it's only business. Then he turned and walked down the steps like a man leaving his signature on a contract. When the door shut, I leaned against it and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That's when the thought that had been brewing inside me grew sharper. He thought he'd cornered me, but he hadn't seen me fight yet. That night, I sat at the table again. Only this time I cleared the clutter and spread out paper. I started writing numbers. Not his numbers, mine. My savings, what little I had left from years of careful living. My expenses, bare bones. I calculated, erased, recalculated. Each line of ink reminded me of how close the edge was. But the more I looked, the more one truth hardened inside me. I wasn't going to hand him the last of my dignity. The next morning, I went back to that realtor's office I'd passed. This time, I didn't just drive by. I parked and went inside. The receptionist looked up with that bright professional smile, the kind that doesn't ask questions until you're ready to give answers. I told her I needed to speak with someone about selling property. She hesitated, glanced at my clothes, maybe wondering if I was lost. But then she nodded and called someone out from the back. A man with sharp eyes and a suit that didn't quite fit right walked over, shook my hand, and asked me what I was selling. I told him. He paused, blinked, then asked again to make sure he'd heard me right. I repeated myself. He scribbled something in his notebook, said he'd need to check records, then asked why I was considering this. I didn't give him the full story. Not yet. Just said it was time for a change. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter. Not because anything had been settled, but because I'd made the first move. For the first time in days, I wasn't just reacting. I was acting. But as I turned onto my street, I saw the landlord's truck parked out front. My pulse quickened. I pulled over and sat there, engine still running, watching him walk around the yard like he was already measuring it for something new. I stayed in the car until he left. That moment told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't raising rent to cover costs or scrape by. He was circling, waiting for me to cave so he could either bleed me dry or force me out and flip the place for profit. That night, lying awake, I thought about my kids. I thought about what they'd say if they knew what I was planning. Some would call it foolish. Some might even call it reckless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about me. It was about proving that a man doesn't lose all his say in the world just because someone else has the paperwork. And as I stared at the ceiling, one line kept repeating in my head. If he wanted to treat this place like numbers on a page, then I'd turn the page on him. You might think a man my age would be used to surprises, but truth is, they still shake me. Some knock the wind out of you, others push you forward. This one was a bit of both. The realtor called me back sooner than I expected. Said he'd checked the records, and yes, the property could be listed. His tone was businesslike, but there was a pause in there, like he was curious if I really meant it. I told him I did. I said it plain, the way you say something when you've already made up your mind long before the question is asked. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table again. The same table where the letter had sat like a curse. This time, the paper in front of me was different. Forms, questions, places to sign. It felt almost surreal, like I was finally taking control of the story instead of waiting for someone else to write it for me. I'll admit, a small part of me wondered if I was pushing too far. What if it didn't work? What if he found out before I was ready? What if I ended up not just without a house, but without a plan? Those thoughts sat heavy in the back of my head, but I kept them there. I couldn't let them climb into the driver's seat. Later that afternoon, I went outside to water the small patch of garden my wife used to love. The roses hadn't bloomed much this year, but the soil still carried her touch. As I leaned down, I heard a voice over the fence. My neighbor, old Mr. Evans, asked if I'd seen the landlord hanging around lately. He said the man had been asking questions about me, about whether I was struggling. That stung. Not because of the gossip, but because of the assumption. He wasn't checking on me out of concern. He was scouting like a wolf circling a limping deer. I told Evans I was fine, maybe firmer than I needed to. He raised an eyebrow but didn't push. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. This time it wasn't numbers. It was reminders. Notes to myself about why I was doing this. This is your house. You've paid in sweat what he wants in paper. Don't bow. Writing it down made it harder to back away. The next day, I got a call from my daughter again. She asked if everything was all right because I sounded distracted the last time. I paused, then told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I told her the landlord had raised the rent higher than I could manage. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Dad, you can come stay with us if you need to." The offer was kind, but I couldn't take it. Not because I didn't love her, but because I knew moving into her space would mean carrying my defeat into her house. That wasn't the legacy I wanted to leave. I told her I appreciated it, and I'd figure something out. She sighed, and I could hear the worry in her breath. But she didn't push further. After we hung up, I realized something important. The landlord thought he was just dealing with an old man, someone with no fight left. He didn't see the years behind me, the struggles I'd weathered, the jobs I'd worked when my back ached, the bills I'd paid when the numbers barely added up. He didn't see the reservoir he was poking at. And maybe that was his mistake. The realtor called again 2 days later. He said he'd lined up a photographer to come take pictures if I was ready. I told him yes. Saying the word felt like a stone hitting the ground, final, undeniable. That evening, I stood in front of the house with my arms folded, looking at the windows, the roof, the yard. I thought about how many times I'd patched something, fixed something, scraped by just enough to keep it standing. And now, for the first time, I was choosing to change the story, not being forced to. The irony wasn't lost on me. He thought raising the rent meant he had the upper hand. But soon, there'd be a sign in front of this house that told a very different story. Funny thing about decisions, you make them in a quiet room, at a table, or on a phone call, and they feel solid. But once the world starts pressing against them, you wonder how much weight they really carry. That's where I found myself. I'd signed the papers, set the process in motion, but the landlord wasn't going to sit back and let me outplay him without a move of his own. Started small. He showed up unannounced one afternoon, pretending to check the gutters. I caught him glancing at the windows and scribbling something on a pad. When he saw me, he smiled that tight smile people wear when they're not being honest. Asked me if I was managing okay. I told him yes, plain and firm. He nodded, but I could feel the question behind his eyes. That night, I wrote again in my notebook. I wasn't just keeping track of numbers anymore. I was keeping track of behavior. Dates, times, what he said, how long he lingered. If he was going to make me prove myself, I wanted the record to show more than just his signature. 2 days later, the realtor stopped by with the photographer. They walked through the house, snapping pictures, talking quietly about angles and light. I stood in the hallway, out of their way, but my heart was pounding. The click of the camera felt louder than it should, like it was announcing my intentions to the whole street. And sure enough, before the sun had set, there he was again. The landlord parked his truck out front and just sat there for a while. He didn't come to the door this time, didn't even step onto the property. Just sat in the cab, arms crossed, staring. It was a message, clear as any words. He knew something was happening, and he was waiting to see if I'd break first. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window, watching him finally drive off. I thought about all the years I'd lived under someone else's rules, how many times I'd paid what was asked because I had no other choice. This time I did have a choice, and that meant I had something he didn't expect. My daughter called again the next morning. She'd been searching online, she admitted, for houses in my area just in case. I could hear the hope in her voice when she asked if I wanted help looking. I thanked her, but I didn't tell her about the photographer, the listing, or the landlord's truck. Some things you keep close until they're ready to be spoken. Later that week, a small sign appeared on the lawn. For sale. Just 2 words, printed in red and white, but it felt like thunder rolling across the street. Neighbors walked by a little slower than usual, glancing at the sign and then at me. I nodded, but I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The landlord came by again that evening, this time knocking loud enough that the sound echoed through the house. I opened the door, steady as I could. He asked me what was going on, his voice sharper now, less polite. I told him straight. The property was being sold. He blinked, like he hadn't expected me to say it aloud. You can't just, he started. But I cut him off. I've got the deed. I've got the paperwork. You raised the rent too high, and now it's out of your hands. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavy. Then he muttered something under his breath and walked back to his truck. He didn't slam the door, but he shut it with a force that said plenty. When he drove away, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but a step closer. The kind of step that tells you the path is real, even if it's still uphill. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was settled, but because for once I wasn't just reacting. I was shaping what came next. When a man feels cornered, he doesn't always act with reason. That was the thought that stayed with me after I closed the door on the landlord that night. I knew he wouldn't walk away quietly, not after years of holding the upper hand. And if he couldn't control me with rent, I wondered how else he might try. The next week proved me right. A letter came in the mail, not from him this time but from a lawyer with his name at the top of the page. I sat at the kitchen table reading the claims. He was contesting the sale, saying I didn't have proper authority. My chest tightened as I scanned the words. It wasn't about truth, it was about delay. If he could stall, maybe I'd cave. Maybe I'd run out of strength or money before the sale went through. I didn't call him. I didn't yell. Instead, I drove to my attorney's office and laid the letter flat on the desk. She read it, frowned, then looked me in the eye. He's bluffing, she said. He's hoping the noise will scare you off. It didn't scare me. Not this time. But it did remind me I was playing against someone who didn't mind bending the rules to protect his control. That evening, I walked the boundary lines of the property, slow and steady. I ran my hand over the fence posts, checked the locks on the gates. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. If he wanted to drag me into a fight, I'd be ready with every fact and every record. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to carry a strange air. Strangers walked through with the realtor, nodding, whispering, imagining their lives in rooms where my life had been. Some part of me wanted to shout at them, to tell them the battles fought inside these walls, the memories tucked into every corner. But I stayed quiet because selling meant more than nostalgia. It meant freedom. One afternoon, while a couple toured the kitchen, I noticed the landlord's truck creeping past again. He slowed at the sign, stared hard at the open door, then drove on. He wanted me to see him, to feel his eyes on me. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I offered the visitors a smile and asked if they had any questions. That night, my daughter called. She'd heard from someone in town that the landlord was making comments, saying I was too old to manage on my own, that I didn't understand what I was doing. I laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was the bitter kind of laugh that comes when you realize some people never see you as more than a pawn in their story. I told her not to worry. I said I had it handled, and in truth I did. But I also knew the final confrontation hadn't yet come. It arrived sooner than I thought. The realtor called me one morning with news. An offer had been made. A real, serious offer, close enough to what we'd listed that it could go through quickly. My pulse jumped. A mix of relief and fear. Relief that I was close. Fear of what he'd do when he realized it. And sure enough, that evening, the pounding came at my door, louder than before, rattling the glass. I opened it to find him red-faced, papers in his hand. He shoved them toward me, shouting about rights, about how I couldn't just strip the place from under him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match his anger. I simply pointed to the notepad I'd kept for weeks, now fat with entries. Every visit, every threat, every delay, is all written down. If you want to fight, I'll bring this with me. He froze. Not because he feared the notes, but because for the first time he saw I wasn't bending. He wasn't staring at the tenant he used to squeeze for rent. He was staring at the man who'd learned to stand with both feet planted. He swore, turned, and stormed back to his truck. Tires screeched as he pulled away. I stood there in the doorway, heart pounding, but stronger for it. Inside, the kettle whistled on the stove. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table where it had all started, with that first letter. Only now, the table held not fear but resolve. The offer was on its way, the papers nearly ready. He could circle the block all he wanted. The ground had shifted, and it was no longer his to control. People think standing your ground looks like shouting, fists pounding, anger spilling over. But sometimes it's just a man sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea, deciding not to back down anymore. That was me the night he stormed off. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't questioning myself. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Still, feeling steady and being safe aren't the same. I knew he wasn't done. Men like him don't quit when they lose an argument at the door. They find new ways to press. The realtor called again 2 days later. The buyers were eager, but word had spread. The landlord was talking around town, suggesting he had claims, whispering doubts about the property. She asked if I wanted to delay the listing, give things time to cool. I told her no. Delay was his weapon, and I wasn't about to hand it to him. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. This was a small town. I'd lived here decades. To hear that my name was being dragged through backrooms and corner tables, it wasn't just business. It was an insult to my life's work. That night, I sat with the ledger my wife used to keep. Pages of bills, payments, repairs, every nail, every coat of paint written down in her careful hand. Proof that we hadn't been careless, proof that this place wasn't some liability waiting to collapse. Looking at it, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for a sale. I was fighting for my dignity, for her memory, for every year we kept that roof standing. So I made copies. I boxed up receipts, photos, the survey papers, the letters. Not just for court if it came to that, but for me to know I had the truth at my back. The following week, my daughter came by. She brought groceries, though she pretended it was just a visit. She sat across from me, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and said, "Dad, you don't have to carry all this yourself." I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't a child anymore. Yet I still tried to shield her from weight that had long since spilled into my life. I wanted to say I had it under control, but instead I said, "I don't want you to remember me as someone who let another man decide my worth." She didn't argue. She just nodded. And in her silence, I felt understood. As the sale moved closer, I could feel the tension coil tighter. The buyers asked for a final walkthrough, and I agreed. When they arrived, they brought their young son. He ran through the hall, laughing, touching the walls like he was already moving in. I stood back, watching. There was something both painful and healing about it. Painful because I knew it wasn't mine anymore. Healing because maybe that's what homes are meant for. Passing on to the next set of hands, the next story. After they left, I noticed the truck again. Parked this time. He didn't knock. He didn't yell. He just sat there, engine running, watching. I went out onto the porch and met his eyes across the distance. Neither of us moved for what felt like a long stretch of time. Then he drove away. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was something. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I thought about the years I'd paid him rent. I thought about the letter that started all this. And I thought about the for sale sign planted in the yard. A sign he hated more than anything else. That sign wasn't just about selling, it was a message. A line in the dirt that said, "You don't own me anymore." And I realized something important in that quiet moment. Sometimes the fight isn't about beating the other man. It's about not letting him break you before the end. Funny thing about silence, it doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just the air before the storm. After he drove away that night, I should have felt relief. But instead, it felt like he'd left me a promise. One I couldn't quite hear but knew was there, waiting. 2 mornings later, I found a notice pinned to the fence. Not an official one, no letterhead, no stamp, no seal. Just a sheet of paper with big block letters. Property in dispute. Someone had stapled it crooked, the edges flapping in the wind. My gut told me who was behind it. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was trying to poison the well. The realtor called within the hour. "Buyers are nervous," she said. "They want to know what's going on." Her tone was polite, but I could hear the frustration underneath. She was fighting for me, but even she couldn't calm their worry completely. I took a slow walk around the yard that afternoon, thinking of my wife again. She used to tell me, "People will test your patience, but don't let them steal your truth." Those words settled in my chest. I decided I wouldn't just react this time. I'd prepare. I gathered my papers again. Deed records, surveys, payment slips. I called the county office and asked for confirmation in writing. When they emailed me the documents, I printed them out, 3 copies each. If he wanted to play games, I'd answer with facts. That evening, my neighbor stopped by. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, eyes darting to the street. "He's been talking again," he said. "Said you forged something. Said the sale's a sham." I let out a laugh, not because it was funny, but because of how desperate it sounded when spoken aloud. Forgery? After 30 years of paying him? It was absurd. Still, I knew rumors had power in a place like this. When my daughter came by later, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out like armor. She frowned and asked, "Dad, is it worth it? All this fighting?" I stared at her, the words heavy in my mouth before I spoke. "If I let him win now, I'll be giving him more than the house. I'll be giving him every year we lived here, every dollar I scraped together to keep the lights on. That's not just business. It's my life." She didn't push further. Instead, she put her hand on mine, and for a moment, I remembered the small girl who used to climb into my lap when storms rattled the windows. She wasn't a child anymore, but the comfort was the same. The next week brought the showdown I'd expected. The buyers asked for a meeting face-to-face with me, the realtor, and him. They wanted everything clear before signing. We gathered at the office, a small room with a long table. He came in late, jaw tight, papers clutched like weapons. He dropped them onto the table with a thud. "This sale isn't valid," he said flatly. "He doesn't own the rights he claims." The buyers exchanged uneasy glances. The realtor's jaw tightened. I leaned forward, steady, and slid my own folder across. "Everything you see here has county stamps, signatures, and records older than your first mortgage. If you want to argue, argue with the courthouse, not me." For a second, no one spoke. Then the realtor lifted one of my documents and read aloud the dates, the signatures. She looked at the buyers, not at him. "This is valid," she said firmly. He bristled, his face red, but the more he argued, the more desperate he sounded. The buyers didn't say much, but I could see their minds working. They weren't just buying a property anymore. They were seeing what kind of man he was. When the meeting ended, he stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. I stayed seated, breathing slow, my hands still resting on the papers. The realtor turned to me. "That helped," she said quietly. "They'll still think about it, but you held your ground." Walking home that evening, I realized something had shifted. He hadn't expected me to show up prepared. He thought I'd come empty-handed, afraid. Instead, I'd faced him with truth. And though the battle wasn't over, I knew I'd scored my first real point. But I also knew this: men like him don't give up just because they lose once. If anything, this loss would push him further. And the thought of what might come next kept me awake long into the night. I used to think battles were decided in big moments. The slammed doors, the heated words, the meetings where papers flew across tables. But standing at my kitchen sink the morning after that confrontation, I realized it isn't always like that. Sometimes it's the quiet days after, the waiting, when you don't know if the other side is regrouping or retreating. that waiting can eat at you more than the fight itself. The buyers hadn't backed out yet, but they hadn't signed either. Every ring of the phone made my chest tighten. Was it the realtor with good news? Or him, calling from another number, ready to taunt me? Most times it was neither. Just silence broken by the hum of the fridge and the sound of traffic rolling past the house. One evening I heard gravel crunch outside. I peeked through the curtain and saw his truck parked at the edge of the road. He didn't get out, just sat there, engine idling, headlights burning a line across the yard. For a while I thought he might come to the door. Instead he pulled away, slow, like a hunter not ready to spring yet. That night I barely slept. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like someone rattling the lock. I kept the deed folder beside me on the nightstand, as if those papers could guard me better than a lock. The next day I went down to the county clerk's office in person. I wanted something more than emails and printouts. I wanted the seal, the signature, the proof in hand. The clerk, a woman with kind but tired eyes, pulled the books and showed me the chain of ownership stretching back decades. My name sat there plain as day. She stamped a fresh copy for me. "Don't let him scare you," she said as she slid it across the counter. Her words stayed with me. It wasn't just about the property. It was about someone thinking they could lean on fear instead of truth. Back home, I laid the stamped copy in the folder with the rest. My daughter stopped by that afternoon, catching me mid-stack. She shook her head. "Dad, you're treating those papers like weapons." "In a way they are," I told her. "He's using lies, and this is what I've got." She wanted me to let the realtor handle it, but I couldn't. This wasn't just her fight to clean up. It was mine. A week later, the realtor called with cautious optimism. The buyers wanted a final walkthrough. She thought they were leaning back toward signing, but they wanted one more look at the property, probably to make sure there wouldn't be surprises. When the day came, I met them at the house. The sun was out, warm enough to soften the air. For a moment, it almost felt like a normal showing. We walked through the rooms, the hallways, the yard. They asked practical questions about repairs, taxes, boundaries. I answered as directly as I could. Halfway through, his truck rolled up. He didn't get out, just parked along the road like before. I caught the flicker of unease in the buyers' faces. He wanted them to see him there. Wanted to remind them that even if the papers said one thing, he could still haunt the deal. I walked over to the fence, slow but steady. He rolled down the window and smirked. "Enjoying your little tour?" he asked. "It's not little," I said. "It's official. The county says so. The bank says so. The records say so. The only one who doesn't is you." He leaned back in his seat. "You think that matters? People believe stories, not paperwork. And I've got plenty to tell." I looked him in the eye and answered, "Then keep talking. I've got proof. And proof doesn't bend." I turned and walked back toward the buyers without waiting for his reply. My legs felt heavy, but I didn't let it show. If he saw hesitation, he'd take it as an invitation. The buyers didn't say much as they wrapped up, but I noticed they lingered longer than before, testing faucets, opening closets, checking foundations. Maybe they were trying to see past the shadow he was casting. That evening, the realtor called. "They haven't decided yet," she said carefully. "But they told me something important. They saw how you handled yourself today. That mattered." Her words steadied me. For weeks I'd been playing defense, reacting to each stunt he pulled. But today, for the first time, I felt like I'd set the tone. Not just for the buyers, for myself too. Still, doubt lingered. What if the buyers walked away anyway? What if he managed to drag me into court just to stall? I sat on the porch late into the night, listening to the crickets, the far-off sound of trains, the silence between. And in that quiet, I made myself a promise. Even if these buyers slipped away, I wouldn't stop. I'd keep the folder ready, keep the truth close, and keep standing where I belonged. Because the real fight wasn't just about selling the house. It was about not letting him write over my story with his lies. I thought the worst he could do was scare off buyers. But he wasn't finished. A week later, I got a letter in the mail, thick paper, formal seal. My name printed on it, demanding I appear in court. He'd filed a claim saying the deed I carried wasn't valid, that I was squatting on property that still belonged to him. It was nonsense, and I knew it, but nonsense dressed in legal clothes can still make you sweat. I sat at the table staring at the letter. The walls felt closer than usual, the room shrinking. For years I had trusted records, dates, stamps. Now I had to face the truth that he was willing to twist all of that if it meant keeping his grip. My daughter called the lawyer she knew, a steady man who spoke without rushing. He looked over the papers and said, "You've got the stronger case. But remember, he isn't trying to win. He's trying to wear you down." That line stuck with me. It wasn't about truth to him. It was about pressure. The first hearing was set for a Tuesday morning. I dressed in my plain jacket, nothing fancy, just what I'd wear to church. The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor polish. People milled around, waiting for their names to be called. He was already there when I walked in, sitting with a lawyer I didn't recognize. He didn't look at me at first, but when he did, his smile was small and sharp, like someone who thought the trap had already been sprung. When the clerk read the case, I stood and walked to the table. My hands were steady, though I could feel the weight of his stare from the other side. His lawyer started with big words: fraud, mistake, misfiling. He painted a picture of me as someone who had slipped in through a crack and claimed what wasn't his. I wanted to interrupt, but my lawyer touched my sleeve, a small signal. Wait, let him talk himself out. When it was our turn, my lawyer opened the folder. He placed the stamped records, the tax receipts, the chain of ownership on the judge's desk one by one, each marked with seals and signatures that couldn't be brushed aside. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, flipping through pages. The landlord shifted in his chair. I saw his jaw tighten. His story wasn't holding against the paper trail. Still, his lawyer pressed. But there's confusion over the boundaries. Our client has always acted as the owner. The judge looked up, voice flat. Acting as the owner and being the owner are not the same thing. That line landed heavy. I didn't smile, but inside I felt something steady take root. The hearing didn't end with a final ruling that day. The judge ordered both sides to provide full documentation. Another date set, another waiting period. But walking out of that room, I felt different. For the first time, it wasn't just me saying I belonged there. The judge's words gave weight to what I'd been carrying all along. Outside the courthouse, he walked up to me, close enough that I could smell the cigarette smoke on his jacket. His voice low so others couldn't hear. "You think this is over? Paper doesn't matter. I can keep this tied up for years." I looked at him and answered plain. "Then you'll be the one wasting years. I'm not moving." He sneered and turned away, but I noticed something. His steps weren't as quick as before. The weeks waiting for the next hearing were long. Some nights I sat awake, listening for his truck, expecting another stunt. But he didn't come around. Maybe the courtroom had clipped some of his swagger, maybe not. Either way, the silence was its own kind of tension. My daughter asked if I ever regretted not selling sooner, before all this mess. I told her no. If I had walked away early, I would have carried the weight of his lie forever. This way, win or lose, at least I was standing on record. The second hearing came quicker than I expected. This time, the judge spoke with more finality. After reviewing both sets of records, he declared the deed valid. My name was the lawful owner. His claim dismissed. Hearing those words, I didn't cheer. I didn't shout. I just breathed, slow and steady, like someone finally putting down a load they'd carried too long. He stormed out before the judge even finished. His lawyer gathered papers in silence. As I left the courthouse, the sun hit me in the face, bright enough to make me squint. It wasn't victory that I felt, not exactly. More like release. But I knew it wasn't the end. People like him don't stop because a judge says so. They stop when they've burned out their last match. And I could already sense he still had some fire left. When the gavel came down and the judge's words echoed in that room, I thought it would feel like an ending. But life doesn't hand you neat endings tied up in bows. Sometimes it gives you a verdict and leaves you to figure out what that verdict really means. I walked out of that courthouse lighter, yes, but also thinking about the years I'd spent under his shadow. The man had tried to strip me down to nothing, just another tenant, another body he could push out of the way. And yet here I stood, recognized in law and in truth as the owner. That didn't erase the strain. It didn't erase the nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd wake up to find a bulldozer at my door. But it gave me something else. Proof that standing still, refusing to move, had meaning. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. He didn't drive past the house anymore. No headlights sweeping across my yard at midnight. No letters tucked under the door. He didn't even send his lawyer to drag things out. It was as though the courthouse had drained the fight from him. Or maybe he realized he couldn't win against documents stronger than his bluster. Neighbors stopped by more often now. Some came with pies, others with handshakes, and a few just wanted to stand in the yard and talk. One of them, an old friend of my late wife, said, "You showed all of us something. You showed that you don't have to roll over when someone decides you're weak." I didn't answer right away. Compliments like that sit heavy on me. I only said, "I just did what I had to." My daughter came by on weekends, checking the locks, walking the boundaries of the lot with me. She asked once if I felt safe. I told her the truth. Safe isn't the right word, but I feel seen. And that's enough. One evening, I stood in the doorway looking at the setting sun catching the roof shingles, making them glow red for a moment. The house had stood through storms, through winters that cracked the windows and summers that baked the ground. Now it had stood through this. I thought about the men who built it long before I lived here, the hands that laid each board, the backs bent under weight. They couldn't have known I'd be here, fighting to keep it. But I like to think they would have understood. I never heard from him again after that second hearing. Some said he moved out of state. Others said his other properties kept him too busy to worry about me anymore. Whatever the truth, it no longer mattered. He had become a shadow that finally faded when the sun rose. What mattered was what I carried forward. I learned something about myself through all of it, that the value of a man isn't in how loud he speaks or how much land his name covers on a map. It's in whether he can stand, silent and steady, when someone tries to erase him. There were nights I sat with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, papers spread out before me. The deed, the receipts, the court ruling. I'd read them not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to remember. To remind myself that dignity isn't handed down. It's claimed, and once claimed, it has to be guarded. I think about all the people who've had someone treat their years of sweat like nothing more than a mistake to be corrected, a debt to be collected. To them, I'd say this: you're not just a line in someone else's ledger. You're the record of every day you worked, every bill you paid, every wall you kept standing when others said it would fall. The fight with him didn't give me back my youth. It didn't bring my wife back, or erase the loneliness of nights in this house. But it did give me back myself. It told me that I wasn't finished yet, that I still had a place in this world and the strength to claim it. And that, more than winning against him, is what I carry. After the noise of the courthouse faded and the letters stopped coming, life didn't just return to normal. It took on a new shape. The fight with him had left its mark, and people looked at me differently now. Not just as the old man in the weathered house, but as someone who had drawn a line and refused to be erased. I could feel it in the way neighbors lingered when they walked by, some leaning on the fence to swap stories, others slipping into longer conversations about their own troubles with banks, landlords, or family disputes. I became, without ever asking for it, the person people came to for advice. It wasn't because I had all the answers, it was because I had stayed. And sometimes staying is the most radical thing a person can do. One evening, a man I barely knew knocked on my door. He was younger, maybe in his 40s, with worry etched in his face. He said his landlord had raised his rent twice in 6 months, and he didn't know what to do. He wasn't asking for money. He just wanted to know how I managed to fight back. I invited him in, poured 2 coffees, and told him my story the way I'd lived it. Each step, each setback, each small victory that eventually stacked up into a win. When he left, he said something that stuck with me. "You make me think I can stand up too." That night, after he left, I sat at the table a little longer than usual. The house was quiet except for the clock ticking in the hall. I realized that what I had fought for wasn't just this roof or these walls. It was proof that you didn't have to surrender dignity just because someone expected you to. My daughter noticed the change in me too. She told me once, as we were walking the property line, "Dad, you don't carry it the same way anymore. You're lighter, even when you're quiet." I didn't have a reply for her then, but I thought about it later. She was right. It wasn't that the past had vanished, it never does, but the burden of being underestimated, of being treated like I was already finished, had lifted. The seasons turned. Winter crept in with frost on the windows, and spring followed with new shoots pushing up through the soil by the porch. Each cycle reminded me that life doesn't pause, even when you think it should. I had my routines: mornings with coffee, afternoons walking the boundaries, evenings on the porch with a book. But inside those routines, something shifted. I no longer looked at the deed as a fragile paper that could be taken from me. I saw it as a marker of survival, of persistence. And with every day that passed, the house felt less like a place I might lose and more like a place I had already defended. And won. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about him, the landlord who tried to push me out. I wondered if he ever sat in his own kitchen, staring at his own regrets. Did he feel defeated? Did he move on without a second thought? Or did he carry my refusal to bend as a reminder that not every battle could be bought or bullied into submission? I'll never know. But I do know that his shadow doesn't reach me anymore. The truth is, this house became more than shelter. It became a witness. It saw me through my wife's laughter, my daughter's childhood, the long nights after she passed. And now it bore witness to my refusal to be cast aside. That kind of history can't be priced in rent or reduced to profit margins. Neighbors started calling me stubborn in a different way. Less insult, more respect. The word stubborn used to sting when he threw it at me, like I was too old or too foolish to see reason. But now, when people said it, I heard something else: steadiness. A refusal to let others write the ending of my story. Looking back, I know I could have chosen differently. I could have packed up and left, told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Plenty of people would have understood if I had. But then I'd be sitting somewhere else, looking back on this house with regret, wondering if I'd let him take more than bricks and boards from me. I'd have let him take my right to stand tall. Just when I had started to believe the storm had passed, a new envelope landed in my mailbox. It wasn't the kind I had been receiving during the lawsuit, thick with legal jargon and stamped with cold precision. This one was slimmer, handwritten, the kind of letter that makes you pause before tearing it open. For a moment, I stood on the porch with it in my hand, staring at the faded ink on the front. The name scribbled there wasn't one I expected to see. It wasn't from him, but from someone tied to him. His nephew, as it turned out. I hadn't spoken to the boy in years, not since he used to tag along behind his uncle during inspections, carrying clipboards or fiddling with a phone. Now here he was, reaching out directly to me. My first thought was that this was a trick, another ploy to unsettle me. But curiosity got the better of me and I opened it. The letter was short, almost hesitant. He wrote that his uncle had fallen ill, that the fight over properties had drained more than just money. It had worn him down. He said he didn't know why he was writing, only that he had been told stories about me that didn't match the man he thought he saw years ago. He asked if we could meet. I folded the paper carefully and set it down on the table. For the rest of that evening, I walked the house as though the walls might give me advice. Why now? Why after all this time? Part of me wanted to toss the letter in the stove and watch the flame erase it. Another part, the one that had been tempered by years of holding ground, wondered if there was something left to understand. I didn't answer right away. Days passed. The letter sat on the mantel, its presence nagging at me every time I passed by. My daughter noticed it too. One night, she asked me straight out if I was going to reply. I told her I hadn't decided. She nodded, didn't push, but I saw the question still in her eyes. When I finally picked up the pen, it wasn't because I felt any obligation to him. It was because I wanted to close the loop for myself. I wrote a short note back, that if his nephew wanted to speak, he could come by the house. Nothing more, nothing less. He arrived on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky looks heavy but never breaks into rain. He was older than I remembered, of course. Time does that to all of us, but I recognized the same restless energy in him. He looked around the yard, the porch, the windows, as though he was taking stock of a place he had only half paid attention to as a boy. We sat at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee between us. At first, the conversation stumbled, small talk about weather, about work, about nothing at all. But eventually he got to the point. He said his uncle had told him more than once that I had been the most stubborn man he'd ever met. He said it not as an insult, but almost with admiration, like he couldn't quite believe someone had stood toe-to-toe with his uncle and refused to budge. I listened, careful not to let too much show on my face. I asked him what he really wanted. That was when he leaned forward and said something I didn't expect. He used to say he hated you, but I think what he really hated was that you showed him there were limits. The words hung there, heavy in the room. I thought about all the months of tension, the threats, the courtroom battles, and the weight of those words sank in. It wasn't about me, not entirely. It was about a man who had built his life on the belief that he could bend anyone to his will, and the day he couldn't, something cracked. The nephew didn't stay long. Before he left, he said he was trying to make sense of his family, of the choices that had been handed down to him. He didn't want to repeat the same mistakes. I wished him well, not knowing if my words meant much, but hoping they carried more than silence. After he drove away, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. The house felt different again. Not threatened, not under siege, but touched by another layer of history I hadn't asked for. It made me realize that victories don't always end clean. Sometimes they leave echoes in people you never expected. That night, I sat with the letter again, folded neatly back in its envelope. I placed it in the drawer with the deed, not as a burden, but as part of the story. This house held more than my life. It held the ripples of choices made by others too. And I knew then that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the decision to keep living fully, even with the echoes. I thought the letter from his nephew had closed the book, but instead it opened a door I hadn't expected to walk through. For weeks after that conversation, I found myself thinking about more than just my own fight. I began asking what would happen to this place after me. Holding ground was one thing, but passing it on, making sure it meant something to those who came next, that was another battle entirely. I had lived long enough to know that property isn't just wood, nails, and soil. It's responsibility. When I was younger, I thought of it as survival, keeping a roof overhead, making sure the land wasn't swallowed by men with bigger pockets and louder voices. Now, I understood it differently. The deed wasn't just protection. It was a record. It said plainly that we belonged here, that the effort poured into every corner of this house wasn't wasted. My daughter came by more often in those days. She would sit at the kitchen table while her son played in the yard. Sometimes I caught her looking around, as though measuring whether this place could hold the next chapter of our family. I didn't say much at first, but eventually, I asked her directly what she thought about the house. She admitted she loved it but worried about the weight of carrying it. She had her own life, her own plans. That was the first time it truly sank in. I might not be able to decide what comes after me, not entirely. I could prepare, I could document, I could argue, but in the end, the people who follow will shape it in their own way. Still, I wanted to give her a chance I never had, clarity. No guessing, no scrambling in courtrooms, no half-truths hidden in drawers. So I started gathering everything. Every bill of sale, every old letter, every scrap of paper tied to this house and the land around it. I laid them out across the table, like piecing together a map of where we'd been. Some documents were stained with coffee rings, some folded so many times they felt fragile, but together they told a story, not just of ownership, but of persistence. One evening, I called my daughter over and walked her through it all. Page by page, I explained what each paper meant, why it mattered, and how it tied into the bigger picture. She listened closely, not interrupting, not rushing. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Dad, I didn't realize how much you carried alone." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because it was true. I had spent so much of my life standing guard, never letting on how heavy it sometimes felt. But in that moment, sharing the weight, I realized I had been holding on too tightly. That night, after she left, I sat by the window again. The quiet felt different. It wasn't the silence of waiting for the next fight, or the calm after conflict. It was something closer to release. For the first time, I thought about what it would mean to stop fighting, not because I had lost, but because I had already won. Of course, winning doesn't erase everything. There are still echoes. I would hear his voice in my head sometimes, sharp, commanding, reminding me of all the ways he tried to push me aside. But the more distance I got from the courtroom, the more those echoes sounded smaller, weaker, like they had lost their edge. One morning, while sorting through the drawer where I kept the deed, I came across an old envelope I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't hidden, just tucked between other papers. Inside was a letter from my late wife. She had written it years back when we were first deciding whether to take on this house, when money was tight and doubt was heavy. In her handwriting, clear and steady, she wrote, "If we make this ours, let's promise to defend it, not just for us, but for whoever comes after." I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. It was like she had left a reminder, not only of the choice we made together, but of why it mattered. It wasn't about stubbornness or pride, or even survival anymore. It was about legacy. That night, I called my daughter again. I told her about the letter. I told her that whatever she decided, whether she kept the house or let it go, she needed to do it with intention, to understand the story behind it, to see that it wasn't just lumber and dirt, but years of standing firm when it would have been easier to give in. She promised me she would. I believed her. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the burden had shifted, not in a way that weighed her down, but in a way that connected her to something larger than either of us. And in that shift, I found something close to peace. When I locked the drawer that night, I didn't feel the usual tension in my shoulders. The papers were safe. The story was safe. And I was finally ready to let tomorrow come without fear of what it might take away. I used to think my life would always be defined by battles. Papers shoved across tables, voices raised in courtrooms, family members circling like vultures whenever they smelled weakness. For so long, I carried that fight in my chest, as if it were the only way to breathe. But lately, something has shifted. Not because the world suddenly grew kinder, but because I learned how to carry it differently. After giving my daughter the letter from her mother, the days seemed to stretch in a new direction. I no longer woke with my fists clenched, ready for another confrontation that might never come. Instead, I started to notice smaller things again. The way light slipped across the living room floor in the morning, the sound of my grandson's laughter when he chased the dog through the yard. These weren't distractions. They were reminders of what the fight had always been about. That didn't mean the past was erased. I still walked past the courthouse sometimes, and each time, I felt a tug, as though the walls themselves carried echoes of the days I sat inside, waiting for judgment. I'd picture him there. My brother, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, always convinced he had the upper hand. And for years, he almost did. But what strikes me now is not the anger in his voice, but the desperation under it. He was trying to rewrite a story he hadn't earned. That realization softened something in me, though I'd never say it out loud. One afternoon, my daughter asked if I ever thought about selling the place, moving somewhere smaller, easier. I knew the question came from care, not selfishness. She had seen me struggle up the stairs some mornings, had seen how the upkeep weighed on me. But I told her the truth. I'll leave when it's my time, not before. She nodded, not pushing further. I think she understood that this house wasn't just shelter. It was proof. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the table again, papers spread in front of me. Only this time, I wasn't cataloging them like weapons for a future fight. I was arranging them like a storybook, something my grandson could flip through one day and say, "This is where we come from." It wasn't about teaching him to defend property. It was about showing him that dignity is something you protect, even when others try to strip it from you. There's a quiet truth that comes with age. Victories don't always look like celebrations. Sometimes they look like silence. like being able to sit in your own kitchen without fear of someone pounding on the door demanding what's yours. That silence is its own kind of wealth. Still, I can't pretend the years of conflict didn't leave their mark. I feel it in my bones, in the way I sometimes scan faces at family gatherings, wondering who might be carrying grudges I haven't yet seen. But I've stopped letting that suspicion run my life. Instead, I place my faith in the groundwork I've laid. The papers signed, the stories told, the lessons passed down. Not long ago, I invited my nephew over, the one who first reached out after his father passed. I wasn't sure how it would go. Part of me expected him to carry the same sharpness, the same hunger. But when he arrived, he looked tired, not in a defeated way, but in a way that said he was done with the old wars. We sat on the porch for hours, speaking more about life than land. For the first time, I saw him not as my brother's son, but as a man trying to find his own path. That meeting didn't erase the history, but it eased something between us. Maybe that's all reconciliation ever really is. As the weeks rolled on, I realized the story wasn't about property at all. It was about voice, about not letting mine be drowned out, about making sure the truth of who built this life was never buried under someone else's lies. Holding the deed was only the surface. Beneath it was a lifetime of choices, sacrifices, and stubborn endurance. One night, while closing the curtains, I caught my reflection in the glass. For years, I'd seen a man bracing for the next blow. This time, I saw someone who had outlasted the storm. That recognition didn't make me proud in the way a victory lap might. It made me steady. So where does that leave me now? Somewhere between holding on and letting go. I've done what I could to secure the path forward, but I've also learned not to grip it so tightly that it chokes the people who come after. My daughter will decide in her own time. My grandson will form his own memories here. And me? I've already carved my place. The fight that once defined me no longer does. I don't need a courtroom to prove my worth, nor do I need to convince anyone that I belong. The walls of this house, the soil beneath it, and the people I've loved inside it, they already know. And that's enough. When I lay my head down at night now, I don't dream of disputes or signatures. I dream of mornings, of doors opening, of laughter spilling into rooms I once thought might grow cold. That is my victory. That is the legacy I leave behind. There's something powerful about standing your ground when the people closest to you try to strip it away. What I've learned through all of this is that dignity isn't something handed to you. It's something you hold, even when others try to push you to the back row of your own life. For every betrayal, there's a choice, to shrink or to rise. I chose to rise. And if you've ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, I hope you see that you don't have to stay silent. You can choose to step forward and reclaim the seat that was always yours. But this isn't where the lessons end. What happened to me at that funeral wasn't the only time someone close crossed a line. There was another moment, just as cutting, just as revealing, when a simple joke turned into a test of respect, and my response shocked the entire room. If you've ever wondered how far someone will go before you draw the line, you'll want to see what unfolded next.